In this video, I want to talk about the recent presidential debate, but I also want to talk about categorization, the first thought we had as a species, and what influences biases in perception. Let's start off with an article that was published in the 1950s. They saw a game with quotations around the word saw. You can look this up. It's free to the public. You can get the entire article online. I'm just going to discuss a couple pieces of it. But it was an intense football game between Dartmouth and Princeton. So way more penalties than normal. The Dartmouth quarterback taken out very early in the game because he had a broken nose. He had a concussion. I think it was the third quarter. The Dartmouth quarterback was taken out because he had a broken leg. And so intensity, lots of emotions, and we'll see what might be behind this. But it was two observant psychologists that noticed when the Princeton paper had written up its account of the game and the Dartmouth paper had also written up its account of the game, the two were so vastly different, the psychologists questioned if they were even watching the same game. So they decided to dig a little deeper. So they brought students in who had watched the game and asked them questions like, which team do you think started the rough play? Do you think Dartmouth started it? Well, 36 of the Dartmouth students agreed, but 86 of the Princeton students agreed that Dartmouth started it. And do you think Princeton started it? Well, only 2 Dartmouth students agreed to that, and actually none of the Princeton students agreed with that. And do you think both started it? 53 of the Dartmouth students agreed with that, but only 11 of the Princeton students agreed with that. And do you think the game was unnecessarily rough and dirty? 42 of the Dartmouth students agreed with that, 93 the Princeton students agreed with that. And that's when you get to this wonderful place where you don't have to use complex statistics. The numbers speak for themselves. And, twice as many tells you that they probably were not observing the same game, at least in their mind's eye. So they brought students in who weren't at the game, and they showed them a video of the game and noticed what they noticed and what they did not notice. And sure enough, the Princeton students were twice as likely as the Dartmouth students to notice when Dartmouth broke the rules. And I've experienced this myself. So I'm a soccer dad, and I've watched my son play soccer now for over 10 years. He's 16. And it's fascinating, but also a little intimidating and scary as our species so easily gets pulled in to abstract worlds and conclusions and biases in perception. So the other soccer parents on our team, I'm going to use a lot of air quotes on this video, they're doctors, lawyers, professionals here and there, but I've seen them be transformed as they scream at the top of their lungs that the ref made a bad call. And at that same moment, the other team yells back with just as much enthusiasm and passion that, no, the ref made the correct call. And so were we watching the same game? Well, that's where we get to the differences between reality and abstraction. So the paper concluded that there was no game. And that's true. The game is in our mind's eye. It's an abstraction. The football field's real. The soccer field's real. The ball is real. The goalpost, the goals, these are all real. And there's people out on the field. The game is in our mind. The teams are even in our mind. The rules are in our mind. And so when we get to common sense, that's when we get to things that we can all share because they are common to our sensory experiences. Like, no one argued when the person broke their leg. No one argued with things like the goalpost or is the field there. We argue about differences in the abstract world. So the first clue we have about biases in perception that could lead to people watching the same game but coming to different conclusions is that these differences don't seem to occur in the real world, the real physical world that we are conscious of, as I talk about in so many of my other videos. These biases in perception come about when we enter the abstract world. And that's where we get to the presidential debate. And so what was real and what was abstract? Well, in reality, there are 2 people who were standing on a stage saying words for 90 minutes. And what was abstract? Well, there's a lot of abstractions going on here. One abstraction was that some of them, some of the words that they would say referred back to the real world. Many of the words that were said did not. They were what I call in my other videos made-up words, this abstract tendency what modern humans have to make up words. We think they're real, but they don't refer to anything back in reality, and so they're made up. And many made-up words were thrown around. But even their power, this idea of presidents and governments, these are all made-up words because they don't reference anything that we can directly experience. They're a social construct. They're a social agreement that they are possibly going to be the next president. And even their leadership is something that is defined by the masses. And so there was a time when leadership was a physicality. In other words, the leader was the one in the front who led the way. Now that has become an abstract notion of one who makes complex bureaucratic decisions for us in our absence. And so, again, the reason I point that out is because the biases, so when the debate was over, people came to radical different conclusions of what they had observed. Well, they didn't come to radical different conclusions based on the physicality. No one said that there were really 3 people out on the stage. People knew that there were 2 individuals. Who was on the left, who was on the right. Things like that were not debated. It was when they got into the abstractions. That's when we found biases in perception. So what causes this? Well, let's go back to the primal thought, the first thought humans had. And I often talk about 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's such an interesting depiction of how our ancestors may have had their first thought. And it was when one of our ancestors picked up a bone and thought of it as something it wasn't, thought of it as something creatively new that hadn't been thought about. It thought of it as a weapon. But the one thing I haven't talked about that is a weapon against whom? Or who, whatever. And so the point is that that's when the us versus them category was first established, because that weapon was now going to be used to protect this tribe against another. And so when it comes to biases in perception, our first thought, which may have been a very useful thought, it may be a thought that is responsible for why we didn't go extinct. Remember, there were 8 different types of humans on the planet, at least 8 at one point in our history. Humans, as we know them today as Homo sapiens, our version of humans is the only one to survive. Why? Could it have been because of this thought of categorization? Us versus them, because that let us work in groups. And as we worked in groups, if these other versions of humans didn't have this ability, they would all work individually. So our groups would always be able to survive these other groups. But how does that thought affect us today? Because we still have that basic mechanisms in the left brain that work, and it's so primal and fundamental to our perceptions that is what creates these biases. See, people think that it's emotion. And I get that. I've been in many of these soccer matches where if you were just walking in, you'd say, wow, this is so much emotion going on here. And it's emotion that's carrying the differences and the biases in perception. But what I would suggest is that it's actually thought, and it's this primal thought that's behind all of it. Because in cognitive behavioral therapy, the whole essence is that thoughts cause emotion, at least for us modern humans. And I'll give you an example in a way you can prove this. Become angry now without thinking about anything. It's very difficult. In fact, the only way you can really become angry or happy or any emotion, you have to think of something first. And then the emotion is a reaction to that thought. So what I'm suggesting is what took place on that field in the 1950s and what took place on that debate stage and our reactions that seemed like we were all watching different realities. It's due to that primal thought, that categorization of who is us and who is them. So as you watch the debate, was one of those individuals part of your tribe? Because if they were, that probably influenced your perception. And it did so in a way that's very difficult to recognize, but it explains, again, how people seemingly are watching the same objective reality, but they come to such radically different conclusions. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about what is reality, because the paper that was published, they saw a game. When we start talking about subtle differences in perception and how these might be influenced by categorization and the different categories that the thinking mind creates, it almost suggests that there is no objective world. But that's not where I'm going with these videos at all. In fact, I would suggest that the modern humans are so all consumed by the thinking mind that it is so dominant in our lives right now that it is all but casting out reality in its entirety.